Hi everyone and welcome to the channel. In this video, I will discuss a question that one of my viewers asked that I think is quite relevant for the understanding of psychology and especially the practical implications of attempting to undergo what Jung referred to as individuation. The question posed is how to avoid deception when being aware of projection as a fundament of two people's interaction. And now, to explain that, essentially what the core of the question is here is, if you know, as we've discussed in other videos, that projection, especially shadow projection in Jungian terms, plays a large role in the interaction of two people. Now, for Jung, as I'll get to in a minute, projection is a much larger phenomenon than for Freud. Then how do you avoid simply going around interacting with other people and saying, oh well, they're just projecting and I don't have to pay attention to what they're saying, and how do you actually make projection a useful force in attempting to engage in self-development and psychological growth? Now, before I want to get into that and answer the question or attempt to answer the question again, like I don't really, I don't know the definite truth, who does, right? But I'm going to attempt to give an answer. I'm going to attempt to give you my perspective, and I'm going to attempt to sort of pin that answer down. But before I'll do that, I want to briefly tell you what Freud thought projection was and elaborate on that a little bit. I prepared some text, I brought some citations as well, and then I want to give you Jung's perspective very briefly. Again, sort of reiterate that I did make another longer video on projection in the Jungian context in conjunction sort of with what Jung thought about the shadow and the individuation process, but I will give you some insights here again, and then ultimately I'll get into my perspective on projection and how sort of to integrate that with the question as well, and how you can avoid ultimately this gesture of deception. So stay tuned. I think this video will be about 15 to 20 minutes long. So and again, the as always, the good part is at the end, I guess. The beginning is more of a reiteration of stuff that we already have discussed in other videos. So if you're interested in a more in-depth perspective on concepts like the shadow, concepts like the unconscious, if you're totally new to Jung, totally new to psychoanalysis perhaps even, then I recommend you stop the video and you go and watch other videos from the channel first, and then return to this video when you have an understanding of some of those fundamental concepts. Now, I will also interlude the concepts very briefly, but again, if you sort of if you're like, oh wait, what's the unconscious again, and how does that make sense in this context, or what's an ego exactly, and is it really what I think it is, then you may want to jump over to these other videos and explore them. Before I start though, just one brief note. If you are interested in these concepts and you want a more in-depth knowledge, you may want to consider reading about Jung and etc. And if you don't know where to start, then check out the description of the video. I'm giving away a free reading list with readings on Jung and beyond that you can you can receive it by simply filling out a form. It's like 2 questions, so I can individualize the reading list I'll send you. I have a couple of different ones in petto, so to speak. But let's get right into the video without further ado. So, Freud's perspective. I will read out to you what I wrote a little bit in preparation for this video, and then I'll elaborate on it freely, associate along those lines. So, Freud, who coined the term projection as a defense mechanism, viewed it as a means by which individuals unconsciously attribute their unacceptable desires, thoughts, or feelings to others. In Freud's view, projection serves to alleviate the anxiety caused by the internal conflict between the ego, superego, and id. In interactions with others, if someone consistently blames external factors for their own unconscious conflicts, Freud would likely argue that this is a form of self-deception, effort to preserve the ego from confronting painful truths, so a form of projection, right? In his introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, Freud describes this as, this is a quote, "We discover that the subject perceives in another person those wishes or tendencies which he rejects and hates in himself, and he strives to overcome this unendurable contradiction by projecting these unwelcome impulses outside of himself," right? So essentially, this is the typical kind of moment where he would essentially, like you're in a fight and you're with your spouse, let's say, and in my case, with my wife. I'm in a fight with my wife, and I tell her, what would I say? I'd say you never have time for me, right? Like you never you never take the time to actually be with me, and so on and so forth, and really be in that moment, and so on and so forth. And by the way, you're also very dirty. You don't clean the kitchen and everything, all that. So in that case, and let's assume that I don't clean the kitchen, I never have time for her, right? In reality, although I couldn't possibly attend to that, right? But I'm projecting it outward. I'm throwing it onto her, right? This is pretty unsubtle, but usually it's less subtle things, right? I think the example "you don't have time for me" to some degree makes sense, but what often happens is it's deeper than that, right? Like you would say something like, and you often have this in with clients, like they'd say, yeah, but my wife, she doesn't love me, and she's not very caring and very nurturing and whatever, and so on and so forth. And then you discover in conversation with them that actually that's their attitude towards their spouse, right? That they don't love them, and they're not caring for them, and so on and so forth. But they'll first discover that in the other, right? And that's obviously because the ego attempts to defend itself from the realization of that factor of itself in Freud's view here. And this could also be true for sexual desires, right? If it's like, oh, you don't, or you always want to have sex, and so on and so forth, then that may be, if we're on the level of sort of the more primal drives, you would say, then perhaps that could also be a factor here. And then I continue writing. For Freud, such projection can become a tool of self-deception when an individual refuses to accept responsibility for their own inner conflicts. By attributing these conflicts to others, the person avoids self-awareness and accountability, insulating themselves from the discomfort of introspection. So introspection would be then accepting, essentially, or attempting to accept that which you project outside within yourself. So you attempt to pull that back within you, and obviously, I mean, the ego always in this attempt to protect its own stability, to protect its own integrity, its own continuity, I would say, in sort of a narrative structure or narrative context, but essentially here acting, in this the defense mechanism, really attempting to protect the ego essentially from its own from the necessity of reconsidering its own axioms, I would say. So that's Freud's perspective. Now, for Jung, Jung's conception of projection is more expansive, embedding it within his ideas about the shadow, the repressed or disowned parts of the psyche that one refuses to integrate. Right? For Jung, there's more to the psyche than the kind of personal elements, the kinds of personal elements that Freud attributes to the psyche, right? For Jung, the psyche is composed not only of your own fragments that are pushed away, pushed out of the ego or pushed out of consciousness, but there's also these collective elements, these fragments, I would say, that are not you, right? And fundamentally for Freud, I mean, this is already anticipated here, right? Because for Freud, essentially, the unconscious is fundamentally otherness within yourself, right? That's what it fundamentally represents. That's what it fundamentally is, right? Jung believed that projection happens when individuals disown parts of themselves and unconsciously see these traits in others, often in ways that are exaggerated or distorted. For Jung, self-deception through projection happens when individuals remain unconscious of their shadow aspects, failing to take responsibility for what they project onto others. Now, and Jung writes in The Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious, projection means the expulsion, so the pushing outward of a subjective content into an object. And an object for psychoanalysis is always, it doesn't necessarily, is not necessarily limited to an object like a table or a book or whatever, but an object is also then another human or whatever, another subject. Everything, so starting again, projection means the expulsion of a subjective content into an object. So a content within your psyche, something subjective, onto an object, so onto another or whatever. But it could also be, for Jung, it could well be the object that you push it onto could be a forest. The fear of darkness resulting from you, having been raped as a child or whatever, or having had some kind of experience. It doesn't have to be rape. There's a lot of reasons to be afraid of the dark, or afraid of anything, by the way. Like, there are a lot milder. But you push that into outward, and you project it onto a forest, right? And it is the opposite of introjection, Jung writes. Everything that is unconscious in ourselves, we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. Now, what that means is that projection for Jung has a behavioral consequence, right? Like, for Freud, much of projection is sort of a defense mechanism that is maybe problematic, but Jung really highlights this danger also on the level of the interactions within one's own life, and also on the level of society, right? If you think of Jung's elaborations of the sort of projection, shadow projection, the German shadow projection on the Jews in the Second World War, that's quite interesting in that context, right? Jung believed that to avoid the trap of self-deception through projection, one must engage in the process of individuation, which involves confronting and integrating the shadow. Failing to do so leaves the individual in a state of psychological immaturity, avoiding responsibility of their own disowned parts. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, so in his biography, he reflects on this challenge. To confront a person with his own shadow is to show him his own light. Once he has experienced projection, one recognizes that whatever one sees in others has been brought up from within oneself. I think this is it's a brilliant quote in a way, right? Read it again. To confront a person with his own shadow is to show him his own light, right? Like, it's for Jung, really, it brings forth this idea that the place where you can find your own growth, right? I don't want to use the word truth, but your own developmental aspects, right, if you will, is where you think darkness is most prominent in you, right? And often you can't see that yourself, but it becomes visible in the interaction with others, right? Once one has experienced projection, one recognizes that whatever one sees in others has been brought up from within oneself, right? Like, you see this when someone talks, like when you talk to a parent, right? Or again, a spouse or whoever, a friend, and they tell you all these things, and you sit there and you're like, who are they talking to? And what are they talking about? Like, they go off on this tangent or on these multiple tangents, and the content, whatever they say, has nothing to do with you anymore. And obviously that often happens in analysis itself, right? Psychoanalysis. But in these mundane sort of everyday interactions that we lead with our, even with our neighbors or whatever, but especially with friends and family, it becomes very clear, right? But for Jung, what he highlights then as well is the archetypal aspects of projection, right? Like, the archetypes, in a way, just as they form the trajectories along which contents that you encounter in your everyday life can unfold, they also form the trajectories along which projections that you attempt to make, or that you make, may unfold or may fall, right? It's not a surprise, or it doesn't come as a surprise to me that the forest or the spider are common repositories of fears, let's say, right? Like, why are we afraid of spiders or snakes or forests? It's, well, because a spider or a snake or a forest are fundamentally dangerous things, right? And they're dangerous aspects of the environment that we cannot control, and that we haven't been able to control for thousands of years. Like, who knows what lurks in the forest these days? Well, I know what lurked in the forest, a couple thousand years ago, and it wasn't nice, that's for sure. And and the same goes for a spider. I mean, and then it doesn't mean, when a child's afraid of spiders, it doesn't mean it's afraid of spiders, right? There's something to it, that there's something to the spider that it doesn't have anything to do with the spider, and that may be uncovering projection, right? What do you endow this manifestation with, in some aspects? But now, let's go then to sort of the how to avoid deception, and what is my perspective on this issue, and how to move forward from here, and how to answer that question, right? So the first thing we have to look at is that projection at its core is a chance, right? It's a chance because it's a chance for development on your own level. Like, you can develop if you recognize your projection onto others, and others can develop if you recognize, or if they recognize, projection. So I think for me, no matter if it's really projection or not, it's always an entry point into development, into some kind of movement towards a psychic structure that knows more about itself than it did before. And so the answer to the question, like, how do you know something is deception? Like, when someone talks to you and says, oh, you're so stingy, is that a word? Like, you don't like spending money, that's bad. Then it doesn't, then sure, on the one hand, you can take that, I would say, always as an impulse, and reflect, well, is that really the truth? Is this really related to me? Right? And you can explore that with the person. Now, it depends what level of relationship you have with them, obviously. Right? But it's an interesting aspect, right? And so I would never say, I would say, what anyone says, take that serious, right? Because it may just be something that may be true about you, but don't take it too serious, because that's just pathological, and to some extent, if you take everything serious everyone says, but a fair bit of self-critique is in order. And on the other hand, wherever you can, attempt to delve into that and explore the truth with others, right? And in the end, there's, like, what does it mean to be true? My perspective is, there always seems to be a kernel of truth in whatever anyone says about them and about me, right? It's not just always fully like, oh, they're just projecting, right? Is that really so? Or is there a kernel, like a seed within you that where the root could take hold and therefore establish itself in this perhaps exaggerated manner? Like, there is something dangerous about the forest, yes. Does that mean we shouldn't go into the forest? Probably not. Does it mean you have to freeze whenever you see a forest, or scream whenever you see a spider? Probably not. Should you be cautious of spiders? Probably yes, in general. Is that valid in Central Europe? Probably not so much. But caution is never problematic in the first instance, right? So again, like, my advice, I hate that, but my verdict on this topic would be that projection in the end is a possible pathway of development and nothing more, right? It's one of many pathways, right? And again, like, for Jung, projection as the fundament of reality as a whole, right? You'd say that you're constantly engaging in projection. You're essentially spread out over the world, right? Like, then the question really becomes, what does it then mean to even engage with a reality? And can you, and who cares in the end about these questions, right? I think ultimately the idea is that attention and exploration within these, in a critical manner, is key, right? To this attempt to individuate, to this attempt to develop yourself into something that is more integrated, And that requires you to look and not look away. Like, look and pay attention to whatever's going on. That's key, I think. And then you'll discover if something originates in you or in the other, or, as it always is, somewhere in between, right? I think there's a field in-betweenness that we disregard, right? Deception and projection that opens this dichotomy that I say is not real. I think there is a lot to it that is, in the end, emerges from a dual perspective, from this field in which these two souls that are somehow other but somehow also entangled meet, right? Okay, well, and with that, I will close this video. 5 minutes longer than 15 minutes, but that shall be it. And thanks a lot for tuning in. I really appreciate your support, and do consider to give this video a thumbs up or follow it, and stay tuned. Many videos on similar topics, especially this meeting of the fields and everything, will come out in the next weeks. And yeah, have a good day.